Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Really a pleasure to see so many, I think, in this very spacious room. Hoping for a very energetic session. We also have a lot of online participants, so this is both an on-site and online session. Actually, the plan was to have Karin Garders to just introduce this session. Karin is the acting executive director of CV. She unfortunately couldn't make it, so I'm making a short introduction on her behalf. Why do we focus on water cooperation? Why is that important? We do know that water very much cuts across society, it cuts across sectors, scales, and different stakeholder groups, for example. So it's something that society needs in different ways for productive purposes, for health purposes, but of course also something we need for maintaining our ecosystems and keeping them sustainable and also being able to deliver different types of ecosystem services. We also know that to resolve our water challenges, and there are quite many of them, unfortunately, ranging from lack of decent water services, drinking water supply, sanitation, but of course also services for irrigation and food production and so forth. We really need cooperation to deal with some of these challenges. So it's not less cooperation, it's actually more cooperation that we need. I think one second important point for, why do we need to focus on cooperation is the increased complexity of management and governance linked to water. We have now for many years talked about integrated water resources management. That's an important concept and topic. And for that to be fully implemented, it actually requires cooperation along these lines of stakeholders ranging from governments, private sector, civil society, over to different scales. For example, how do you align national policies with work in cities, work in rural areas, for example. So it's really how you align policies across scales, but of course also across sectors. So how do we work better across agriculture, energy, environment, and so forth? So here it's really important to cooperate to be able to implement these types of management perspectives like the nexus approach or integrated water resources management, adaptive management. So these are just a few examples of approaches, but which really requires cooperation to be realized. We're gathering here today very much for focusing on the challenges and possibilities of water cooperation. What type of solutions are there out there that already works? I think it would be really great to have some inputs also from the audience in different ways. We have a very distinguished panel that also will talk on these topics. Then we will also present some initial highlights of the Water Cooperation Global Outlook report. This is a report that will be finalized in hopefully October, November this year. That's what we're aiming at. And today we are launching a working paper that will highlight some conclusions of water cooperation. I'll come back to this a bit more later on. I think with that, I'll just open this session. Really great to have a lot of people here, and I'm hoping for a very energetic and exciting session. Having said that, we also have a very distinguished panel. I'll introduce that a bit later on. But that's a panel that ranges from people working in very strategic positions linked to river basin commissions, within governments, and so forth. So I think here we're really looking at a very informed debate and discussion on cooperation and how some of these panelists at their home offices, how they work with these issues and what challenges and solutions they see. Okay, that was the introduction. Let's then go over to a brief presentation of the Water Corporation Global Outlook Report. Today we are actually launching this report, so it can be found at our website. Actually, it's a report that is done in collaboration with CIVI and something called the International Center for Water Cooperation. That's a UNESCO center hosted by CIVI. So that's under that umbrella that we are developing this Global Outlook report. The center was established some years back. It's almost 10 years ago now. As mentioned, it's UNESCO CIVI collaboration, but also with the government of Sweden. It's a so-called UNESCO Category 2 center. And the aim is really to, one, develop knowledge on water cooperation. I think that's a very unique mandate of this center, focusing only on water cooperation. So knowledge development is critical. Also capacity building, capacity development, providing different types of policy support, advisory services is also a mandate of the center. And of course, also utilizing these things for building dialogues between different types of stakeholders. So of course, water cooperation is very much about the different actors coming together on different types of platforms and deliberating and addressing their joint challenges in different ways. I already mentioned this here before, so I'll skip this one. I think here I just also want to mention that now with the recent UN Water Conference that was held in New York in March, late March, water cooperation was one of the interactive dialogues. So I think also this report and this initiative on water cooperation is quite timely, and that also will contribute towards these international processes. So the aim here is really that with the Global Outlook report, it's really to increase our understanding of the factors behind cooperation and what policy, governance, capacity, innovation, data, and financing actions that are actually required for improved cooperation, and which ultimately can lead to different types of outcomes. And of course, these outcomes can differ depending on the objective of the cooperation. The way we see it and what we promote as a center is more inclusive, more efficient, and more resilient decision-making related to water. What makes this initiative different from others? I mean, there's already been quite a bit of work on analyzing water and conflicts, for example, and of course that's very relevant. And that's been done for quite some time, actually. So there's quite a lot of research that has been going into that. I think here we are really looking at the other side of the coin. that is cooperation. And actually what makes contextualized cooperation work in the first place. Secondly, we are focusing on what we call country or basin cooperation preparedness. So it's not really assessing the quality of cooperation as such necessarily, but it's more meant to assess how prepared are countries when it comes to cooperation, what's in place, and how will that contribute towards preparedness for water cooperation. Then thirdly, it really highlights water cooperation at different scales, and where we have developed a joint framework of assessment for analyzing transboundary water cooperation. So that's one type of scale we are looking at. Later on today, you will hear my colleague Anton Earl speak on some tentative conclusions from our assessment of some 30 plus basins in Africa. Then we are also assessing cooperation more at the national and subnational levels. So it's really then looking at these different scales of cooperation, and of course where they are very important in their own rights, these different scales. I think typically when one looks at conflict research, it tends to be very much in the transnational framework, for example. So here we are really looking at cooperation aspects, which we think is also a bit more constructive to find solutions of, okay, how should we overcome a conflict in the first place? Of course, where cooperation and conflict, they coexist. So it's not to say that one or the other, it may not necessarily be more important like that, but we think that taking this very cooperative approach, it opens up for different types of solutions and entry points. This is very much the framework that we've been developing. This is kind of presenting it in a bit simplistic overview way. So it's really a framework to generate evidence, to inform solutions, to inform different types of stakeholders on where they are at when it comes to cooperation, and also provide examples of what works and what doesn't work in different types of contexts. I would say that the meat of the assessment is really in the middle here, what we call the characteristics of factors of cooperation. So we are very much assessing governance aspects, leadership, information and data, joint programming, financing, and also something called enabling environment. And of course, where the water sector is not isolated from politics or society at large. Of course, water forms part and parcel of a country's political economy or a region's political economy. So these are also some of the things that we are trying to capture in some different ways in the analysis. Then, of course, we're also looking at some aspects of why is there cooperation, what are the motivations, incentives, drivers for water cooperation, and so forth. And of course, there is a whole range of these drivers, like political economy, as I mentioned, and then, of course, there can also be very much water-related drivers like sharing of water, navigation, for example, and how countries collaborate for different purposes. Then we also have one element which we call more how is cooperation manifested. So it's very much about how is then cooperation expressed. And of course, there is several ways on how cooperation is expressed. Different types of formal and informal agreements. I think that's important to include informal cooperation. There can be different types of joint committees, there can be joint projects, data sharing, joint policies, and many more, of course. So this is the basic framework we have developed, and basically then linked to these factors here assessed. We have then developed what we call a water cooperation preparedness index. For these factors, we have then been utilizing existing global data that we have framed or reframed into this cooperative framework, and where we're making use of already existing SDG 6 and GLAS report data. So that's really where we are drawing the data from. So it's existing data from already ongoing initiative on monitoring SDG progress. Then we have, and just to say a little bit generically on this index, that countries with higher water cooperation preparedness then seem more likely to be prepared for water cooperation across different jurisdictions, sectors, and stakeholders. And where it's assumed that they would have governance systems in place, more responsive leadership, also putting a bit more priority, for example, on collection and sharing of data and information, also providing more priority to investments, joint programming, and so forth. That countries that are ranking a bit higher would have higher degrees of course, these factors of cooperation. So I think then it's really a question of, okay, what does it then look like globally? And where we have done a mapping of this index, and this is the initial analysis we have done. And it's clear that there is actually a big global water cooperation deficit. So actually on this map here, from kind of light green, that's kind of being on the lower side, and then towards the more dark blue or even purplish is then considered to be more on the side of higher or very high preparedness for water cooperation. What we see here, some trends, is that the global average is actually more medium-low, so it's this little bit in between green here. And the most common score was actually low. So I think it's very clear that I have some figures in the next slide. I'll show you there. I think another conclusion is that there are substantial differences between countries. I think it's also fair to say there are quite big differences within regions, for example. And I think here, I mean, another type of conclusion is that we are, yes, there is a deficit, but we can also see that there is substantial room for improved water cooperation around the world. So I think that's also an important message. If we then just go into, just look at some of the figures here. It's, well, Europe is the region that is scoring on average on the higher side and seems to be kind of more well-positioned for water cooperation if one looks more as region by region. Water cooperation in, for example, Africa and Asia is around the global average, whereas then for the Oceania and the Americas are here found to be the least, or the region least prepared for water cooperation. I think for us this was perhaps a bit of a a surprise, actually, and especially where SIDS countries are coming up as ranking very low in this Water Cooperation Index, and which I think is quite troubling, since we know that small islands, developing states, they have a lot of water challenges linked to sea level rise, for example, saltwater intrusion into aquifers, tropical storms. So there is a whole range of challenges, but then they seem to be less prepared as nations to actually deal with these challenges from a cooperation perspective. So if we look at SIDS, for example, actually 82% of the SIDS countries were on the lower side. Actually, the Americas was as much as 92% on the lower side. So it's clear that that region is overall ranking quite low. Then if we look globally, some 61% of the countries, there were 150 countries assessed. That's where we could get data, basically. So 61% are then ranking more from medium low, low to very low. So it's clear that we have a majority of countries on that side. The percentage of countries ranking very high and high is about 17%, and some 21% that is medium high. So it's clear that we have a lot of challenges when it comes to cooperation, and that there is a lot of room for improvements. I think this picture is just to illustrate some of the variability within the regions. Kind of the longer this rectangle, the more variability within the regions. I think here one can say that probably like Europe, Africa, a lot of variability within the region, those two regions, but I think also Asia has a fairly high variability. So it's clear that also within regions there are really, countries are at very different points of water cooperation preparedness. Then one factor we looked at, probably we will see how we can cross-reference also with some other factors, maybe like water security, for example, to see how that plays out with this Water Cooperation Preparedness Index. So here, for example, we just did a cross-referencing with income levels using the World Bank's definition of income groups. I think here that there seems to be a tendency for higher income countries to score a bit better. But I think at the same time, there is not like a clear pattern here, which I think is really good news, because it means that improving water cooperation is not necessarily dependent on national income levels. Actually, we find a lot of upper middle income, low income countries, lower middle income countries also scoring quite well on this Water Cooperation Index. So I think that's also one type of take-home message, that any country, it doesn't matter what income level, you actually have a lot of possibilities on improving on water cooperation. I just stop there, thanking you for your attention. And this report you can find on this website back here. Probably not easy to remember that one, but we'll circulate out some links and so forth to the participants, so you can check it out. Thank you so much, and let's make room for the next presenter here, Anton Earl. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anton Earl. I'm the director of SEWI's Africa Regional Center based in Pretoria in South Africa. So myself and some of my colleagues based at the ARC collaborated with Håkan and his team to look at how some of this methodology plays out in the African context. Africa is arguably the most transboundary continent from a water perspective in the world. There are 64 surface bodies of water that are shared between 2 or more countries, and that's excluding the aquifers. So almost every country on the continent shares a water body with another country. So it actually makes it the ideal continent to focus on and see, well, what's happening there? And in some ways, it's also got a long history of cooperation. And as Håkan said, cooperation is famously understudied. We tend to focus on the conflict side of that coin for maybe it's human nature, but cooperation less so. So we selected 32 basins to analyze and got a lot of data on these 32 basins. So you can imagine the database we were sifting through. The criteria for selection of these basins, it was difficult to work out, well, do you just look at the big basins? But then you're also missing out on smaller basins that are maybe very important in the area, in the areas where they're located. So we said, well, a minimum size of 100,000 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of the Nkomati Basin in southern Africa, for instance. We also wanted a population density above 100 people per square kilometer, which is actually a fairly low population density, but just to cut out ones that maybe there's not a strong amount of a large local community that's actually depending on that water. And the third criteria we looked at was media mentions of potential conflicts in that basin. So if the media was reporting there's some potential conflict, then we found it interesting to look at it. So that's how we came up with the 32. And we're interested more over here of really looking at the institutional aspects of these basins. So we didn't really gather data on all their biophysical parameters, because there's a lot on that, but less on the institutional cooperation aspects. Also, just a side note to say that when we analyze the basins, if we ever make comparisons, we compare a basin to itself over time, because it's impossible to compare one basin to another directly. You have to go through proxy indicators like what Håkan was talking about, because every case really is unique. So if I do make comparisons, it's usually between the same basin over a period of time, how it might have progressed over time. Now, the challenge with analyzing transboundary water management processes globally, this is not just in Africa, everywhere where you go, transboundary water management is seen as something as a very state-centric endeavor. It's governments that negotiate with other governments, and it's almost seen like top secret type of things that you don't want other governments to know about. These negotiations often happen behind closed doors. And then when you finally get to see the resulting agreement that does come out, and that's in the public domain, you are basically seeing the tip of the iceberg. So you read that agreement, and there might be a lot of detail in an agreement reached between countries, but you learn very little about the background. What was the backstory? What was happening late at night when these people were in the same room negotiating, hitting a deadlock? How did they overcome that deadlock? Those interesting stories are very difficult to get out. You have to talk to individuals, but very little of that is published. So learning from different cases and how different cases overcame challenges, how they overcame disputes, becomes very difficult. And yet this is what we should be doing in the water management community internationally, what we all work in. We should be able to advise the participants in a cooperative process that are maybe just starting out on that cooperative process. We should be able to advise them and say, well, this is what worked in XYZ basin. This is what they did. This is how they overcame it. So that's why we felt, well, you need to have a fresh approach because you don't know these background information and detail. So that's what led us to the factors of cooperation. You're all familiar with basic economics, the principles of the factors of production, being land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And by studying these factors of production, you get to know more about productive capacities and potentials in countries. So the definition of the factors of production, you can substitute transboundary water management in there if you will. So if countries can improve the efficiency of the factors of cooperation, they can increase cooperation and create higher quality benefits at lower risk. It's exactly what they're trying to do through cooperation. Any increase in cooperation leads to equitable and reasonable utilization of international watercourses. And the reason we took this approach of looking at the factors of cooperation that I've listed over there is that these factors are more visible. Most of these factors have to be negotiated or discussed and agreed on in meetings where minutes are typically kept. Stakeholders will get engaged with these kind of factors, and crucially, there will be a budget attached to any of these activities. When you talk about information and data, for instance, or joint programming, all of these have a budget. So once you can find a budget line for something, it turns up in the record keeping, and you can study it and get to know more about it. So that's why we took this approach. So we looked at the challenges to the factors of cooperation, like what makes it difficult to do these things. But then more interestingly, we looked at the innovations. And you'd be surprised at the amount of innovation happening across the African continent in relation to promoting cooperation. I got 64 cases of innovation, which happens conveniently to be an average of 2 cases of innovation for each of the 32 cases we studied. But there are probably more, and I'd be interested to hear more. So after the session and after you've had a chance to look at our the interim version of our report, the working paper, if you know of innovations we may have missed, I'd be thrilled to hear more about them. So I'll run you through a few of these challenges and the innovations just to give you a flavor of what we will include in the final report. So the thinking is all the time we identify a challenge to a factor of cooperation, and then we can start learning about the innovations. So for instance, under governance and leadership, big issues around the legal frameworks between member states. Sometimes legal frameworks don't cover the entire basin, or not all basin states are party to the legal frameworks. So this creates disparities in terms of the cooperation taking place. So there's some interesting ways that countries have tried to overcome this. For instance, in southern Africa, the river shared between South Africa, Eswatini, Mozambique, the Nkomati, when the 3 countries negotiated an agreement in 2003, they didn't just include one basin, they included 2. They included the Maputo River, which is hydrologically separate to the Nkomati. But by including 2 rivers, they were able to be more flexible in terms of one country might give up certain things on one basin and then gain more on the other one, and vice versa. So there's an innovation, an innovative practice that came through. The Senegal-Mauritania Aquifer Basin, where the Senegal River, where there's a Senegal River Commission, is adjacent to the Gambia River, where there's a Gambia River Commission, and there's a joint aquifer, Mauritania Aquifer, shared by both rivers. So they formed a joint working group between these 2 river basin commissions to work on the aquifer, for instance. Looking at things like the Lake Chad Basin Commission, it started off with the 4 littoral states, so the 4 states just around the lake itself to start with, and then over time included other states more upstream, so building over time. Looking at issues around stakeholder participation, gender issues are notoriously invisible in transboundary water management. But there's an interesting initiative around the Women and Water Diplomacy Network that's started on the Nile River, which has women from ministries of water and ministries of foreign affairs joining up in a dialogue platform, creating trust on that river. And over time now, that's being instituted in other parts of the world, Central Asia, other river basin organizations in Africa. Information and data, the second one of these factors of cooperation challenges. I mean, the hydrological monitoring networks at a national level, they're not being invested in, they're not being expanded or maintained. So there's limited resources going into this. And yet, if we can't measure and we can't monitor, how on earth can we seek to try and improve that system or develop it? But there are some innovations. SICOS on the Congo River has developed a very interesting joint repository of information, which is crucially accessible by all of the member states in real time. The Nile decision support system is accessible to all stakeholders on a very broad level. So very interesting things happening over here. So several examples around there that we can actually also be looking at. One of the issues with data is, how do you know when you have enough? And I know for policymakers sitting in the room over here, that's a big challenge. Have you ever got enough data to say that now we can make a decision, now we can move forwards? The answer is you've never got enough, right? You always need more. But at some point you have to say, we can move forward with a joint decision. So the basin, which is the Buzi, Pungwe, Save rivers, formed a joint institution called the Bupusa Basin Commission. And they actually then moved forwards by saying, well, we don't have a precise calculation for environmental water requirements, but we jointly agree on the estimated percentage that is needed for environmental water requirements. But they did it jointly and moved forward until the day that they can actually get more precise data. The third area is about joint programming. So working together, of course, is the surest way of building trust. But working together at the transboundary scale is a challenge. You've got multiple actors to work with. Financial resources can be lacking. Political will can be lacking. You find that sometimes the water sector in a specific country, they understand why working on a transboundary scale, on a joint institution, why it's important. But other sectors might not. You might talk to the Minister of Finance in a country or the Minister of Agriculture, and they won't see the value added of working at that transboundary scale. So government officials working on transboundary levels find that they're having to actually motivate and push internally for why you should be investing in this. And that is a big challenge. But again, some good examples there of how you can efficiently work on initiatives. The Kuvala and Kuneni basins, again, hydrologically separate, but when they came to a comprehensive capacity building and technical program, they put the two basins together so that they recognize that the capacity building will benefit both of them. So put that together for those resources. The Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility in the SADC region has been very successful in developing infrastructure in the region, water-related infrastructure, at the transboundary scale. And then once the project preparation process starts proceeding and is seen to proceed by the governments, they find that the political buy-in has also increased. And at that point, they can hand it over to them as well. The Majed River in Tunisia, it was interesting where they developed a national level management system for the river, but it wasn't interfacing with the local actors, local administrations. So they actually launched a project there to work with local municipalities and administrations and other sectors like agriculture to bring them on board in that transboundary process as well. Then finally, the fourth factor is around financing. Okay, there's always not enough money to go around, but it's specifically an issue with working at the transboundary scale because you are competing with multiple priorities on a national level. So, and different countries will have different levels of prioritization for the transboundary process. A downstream country might see transboundary cooperation as being very important because they are affected by what happens upstream, droughts, floods, and so forth. but an upstream country less so. So how do you overcome that? Looking also at the different capacity to pay of different countries in a basin. Some countries might have large financial resources available to them, others less so, and that constrains the degree to which you can collaborate together. Some good examples here involving some of the outside organizations. The Nile Basin Trust Fund ran for just over 10 years, disbursing $200 million in the Nile, and actually was commendable not just for the cooperation between the Nile countries, but commendable for the cooperation between the 10 donors who were putting money into the trust fund. They had to work together and not earmark money for specific pet projects, but say we support cooperation broadly speaking, which is interesting. I gave the example of Zimbabwe and Mozambique sharing 3 rivers, but they put them into one joint institution. So again, finding those various ways to make that work. So to end with, from the analysis of these 32 cases, and I'm just giving you a quick snapshot in the final report, you'll get a lot of this detail along with those innovation cases. Trust is really the lubricant that keeps all of this moving. If you don't have trust between individuals built up over time, you will not get your cooperation process moving forward. It's as simple as that. You don't work government to government, you work human being to human being. All the cases we analyzed, that would come through. What is the trust? What is the relationship like between the individual government negotiators? Looking at that trust building process, there's 3 points that come through across these cases. The first one is gradualism. Small gains are built upon. It doesn't matter that maybe the basin agreement you have in place doesn't cover all the issues that should be taken into account. But if it can take into account some of the issues and it becomes a starting point, there are many good examples where that then over time grows into something more substantial. Professor Tony Allen, that is arguably the originator of theorizing in the field of transboundary water management, which is a very theory-poor field, still is today, but he would always say the technically optimal takes second place to the politically probable. So we mustn't get too wed to a technically optimal solution, but look at what is politically probable over here. The second point is pragmatism. Pragmatism from the perspective of the states negotiating these agreements. There are a lot of examples where countries have actually had to maybe give up on 1 or 2 of their positions in order to get a joint agreement. So they would maybe pull back from a certain position and be flexible, and by doing so, got a joint agreement. And then the third one is the role of outside support. So technical support, financial support, but also, crucially, support in overcoming differences in capacity, differences in power and access to finance between the various states. To what degree can that also push cooperation forward? And in that way, you find that trust can be built between these individuals and upscaled, of course, into the countries they represent. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Anton. Really great intervention. Let's call on the roundtable and the panelists in the roundtable. I'm calling Lenka Tame, Executive Secretary of the Orange Sanqui River Basin Commission, ORASICOM. Calling on Tahani Silayet, Head of Central Department for External Cooperation at the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation, Egypt. Art van der Horst, Senior Policy Advisor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Please come forward. Also Gladys Bekesa, Director of Transboundary Water Resources, Ministry of Water, Sanitation and Irrigation, Kenya. Please. If you can stand like 2 and 2, I think that would be great. Also calling on Calistine Mugaya, Commissioner for Water Resources, Planning and Regulation, Ministry of Water and Environment, Uganda. And finally calling on Hastings Chibuye, Program Manager Water Information Systems for the SAMCOM, the Zambezi Watercourse Commission. Please come forward.
Oh, you are three.
Let's do two and two there.
Two.
Yeah, yeah, thanks.
We are together.
Yeah.
Really great to see this distinguished panel here. I think my first question is, and I think now we heard from myself and Anton, where we have been assessing water cooperation in some different ways, some different scales, with some insights and learnings. But I think what you really do is to work with cooperation in practice. So I think it's really important to hear from you and what you see as what makes water cooperation work in the first place. How can water cooperation at different scales be better aligned? And feel free to use some examples from your own countries and how your own agencies are working with it. I think we should start with a lady here, Gladys, for example. Some good insights from Kenya, please. Some 2 minutes, roughly, so we have time for several rounds. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. What makes cooperation work is, how we can make it work is for maybe the countries who share a resource, identify a common need, a common problem, and so that motivates them to come together to find a need to work together and resolve that issue. Most of these problems are socioeconomic in nature, maybe to have a water supply on a common resource like maybe a shared basin. I'll give you an example from my country and the cooperation that we have within the Nile Basin Initiative, and by extension between Kenya and Uganda. We share a river called Malaba River, and we have come together to have a common project called Angololo Project. This was informed by the need for our people to have water supply and irrigation, develop irrigation. So we are developing it as two partners through cooperation. And this cooperation has been enhanced through the Nile Basin Initiative, NELSAP, and so there was a need for the people, and that encourages us to cooperate.
Thank you so much for that insight. Hastings, over to you.
Thank you so much. I must say, to start with, I was very grateful to see that when I looked at the countries within the Zambezi Watercourse Commission, and we were looking at, the indices looking at water cooperation, I think most of the countries scored very highly, particularly my own country, Zambia. I think that dark blue, so I was pleased. But coming back to the question, you see, for water cooperation to work, there has to be some incentive, like my colleague mentioned. There has to be something that to encourage those countries to come together. Like in our case, the Zambezi Watercourse, I think the challenges that we're facing the countries were to do with the food security, energy security, particularly water security. So the countries that agreed to say, look, for us to face these challenges, we need to come together through this agreement, the Zambezi agreement. We call it ZAMCOM agreement. So that motivated the countries to try to say, like the Africans say, if you want to go far, you need to go a lot of people. But of course, if you want to go faster, you can go alone. So the countries then wanted to see how they can handle those challenges within the Zambezi, particularly the risks of disasters now, where floods and droughts. So these are the things that motivated them to see that work together to resolve these food, energy, and of course, water security issues.
Thanks a lot. I clearly hearing the need for having the right incentives. I think you also alluded to what Anton mentioned as gradualism. It's something that may take time. You take steps at a time, It's an iterative approach, and we'll reach as far today as we can, but of course in 10 years' time we may have reached even further. Over to Tahani, and you work with the Ministry of Water and Irrigation in Egypt. How would you see on these things?
Thank you very much. First of all, I enjoyed very much reading the working paper yesterday. And finally, we're talking about cooperation, not conflict, because usually all the publications are on conflict. So I'm very happy that finally we're analyzing cooperation. But what made me stop are two things. First of all, the SADC, the river basin organizations under the SADC region. This gives a very important note about the importance of being under the same REC, the Regional Economic Commission. I think that this is very important because in that case, you're not cooperating only on water, you cooperate on benefits of the river, so you're cooperating beyond the river, the expression that is said, and this makes lubrication in the cooperation process and also goodwill. So this is something that I think that this is a very important catalyst for cooperation. Another factor or characteristic is the level of complexity, hydrological complexity of a river, and the different interests in the river. So, for example, like in the Nile, where for us, depending totally on the Nile in Egypt with 97%, for us it's a life problem having any threat on the Nile waters. Where in other countries that are dependency are percentage of 0%, for example, in that case, it's not the sensitivity or the vulnerability of the upstream downstream relationship that counts. There is another interest, which is an economic interest, or also a development interest, which we totally acknowledge. But here makes the situation a little bit more difficult. Trust here is a key. Regarding the NBI, for example, at the beginning, sometimes political / legal aspects complicate the situation a little bit because, for example, at the beginning, Egypt was one of the founders of the NBI, and everything was working great until we had the cooperative framework agreement, and here the positions became different. So this is also another aspect that is important. Thank you very much. I think I took my time.
Several great points there, I think. I think, first of all, the need for these regional or sub-regional structures, for example, and I think it's also a good point of looking at cooperation beyond water itself.
Yes.
So it's water as part of a bigger picture in society. Yeah. Lenka, how would you and your organization, knowing you're representing Orasicom, and how are these things playing out?
Okay. Thank you very much. And speaking after the colleagues, I think I more or less agree with 100% of what they've said. I've just used the word triggering, triggering issues, but really speaking to the same language throughout. The fact that in our case, in the case of the Orange Sinku, I think water scarcity, recurring droughts, the upcoming or incoming climate change, these are some of the triggers that have ensured or pushed the countries to cooperate more readily than they would otherwise. But yes, and agreeing to hear from the northern part of Africa, the issue around an economic commission like SADC in our region has made it much easier, I believe, to push forward with cooperation, because in the SADC there was also even a push for
to establish this or to agree on a protocol, which is a framework within which the cooperation on water in the region is anchored. But maybe let me not speak too much because there are two other colleagues, because I'll still catch on with other examples at the later stage. Thank you. Just to say those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Caliste, you are leading a department within your ministry in Uganda that is working both across the borders in your region there, but you also work to operationalize basin management within Uganda itself and working in different water management zones. And how would you see this water cooperation playing out in maybe in both contexts, both the more transboundary perspective, but also the internal perspective and promoting cooperation within the country itself? Please.
Thank you very much. I will start by highlighting the importance of transboundary cooperation with respect to Uganda. Uganda's position as a downstream country within the Nile Basin, but also an upstream country. So our position actually dictates that we collaborate and cooperate with upstream countries, but also with the downstream countries. And for us, transboundary cooperation is not an option, it's a must. 69% of Uganda's water resources come from outside our borders. So again, when we are to ensure that we have water security, we have to collaborate with our upstream neighbors to ensure that the quality of the water, the quantity of water that comes to Uganda is adequate, but also in the spirit of cooperation, we also don't want to hurt our downstream partners. Within the country, again, we are getting water not following administrative boundaries. And administratively, we are bringing different administrative units to work together so that we can have win-win. And through that, we ensure that all of them come together to work together for the benefit of everybody. And again, that's where we look at benefits of cooperation so that everybody can benefit, even if you are upstream, even if you are downstream. So for us, our position within Nile Basin dictates how we behave, and that's why Uganda has actually been a key player in the cooperation on the Nile, and that's why we host the Nile Basin Initiative, because we believe that it's an important body that brings us together to work with our upstream and downstream partners. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Caliste, for these two perspectives, both the in-country and the transboundary perspective. Art, over to you. Working with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course where the Netherlands has its fair share of transboundary waters, and some of the major European rivers having their deltas in the Netherlands, basically, but also that your government is supporting water cooperation around the world. So how would you see water cooperation and kind of contextualized cooperation from your perspective?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the first thing sounds logic, and I heard it already, that the people living in the area should have a real problem, and they should feel about it, and the politicians should be ready to take a position on this problem. And then the second factor, which is very important, there should be a crisis. I want to illustrate that in 2 points. It's one about the River Rhine. The River Rhine flows through 5 countries, and when I was a young boy, I was driving by car from the south to the north to Holland, and then you cross the River Rhine, and even when you close your eyes, you could smell the Rhine. It was an open sewer, and it was very terrible, and people said, okay, we have to do something. But we were talking about 50 or 60 years between all the different states, but nothing happened. Only when there was a major incident in '86 in the Sandoz factory in Switzerland, when a huge amount of pesticides entered in the river, all the fish died, and all the drinking water supplies has to be closed, that action was taken, and the politicians said, now something has to be done. The second example is about the River Meuse. We share it with France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we face floods. And we try to solve these floods by increasing the height of the dikes and giving space, room for the river. But we didn't manage. Now, 2 years ago, there was a very intense rainfall in the area across Belgium, Germany and Holland, and about 200 people got killed. And that was the reason that they took serious action. And now they are talking about how can we improve the situation and decrease the floods in this area. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Art. Let's go over to the second question, which is very much on the what does it actually take for countries to improve their water cooperation? For example, in terms of the factors of cooperation that we identified, like governance, leadership, financing, joint programming, for example. But of course, data is another one. Of course, there can also be others, of course. So, I mean, from your own perspectives, what would you see as perhaps the most important one or two factors you see as here it's very critical to improve? May we start with you, Gladys, again?
Okay.
So you're setting the,
Yeah, it's okay.
the standard, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I think most important is to have institutional frameworks, agreed upon institutional frameworks in place. And this one, I can maybe talk about our examples. We have the Lake Victoria Basin Commission on the Lake Victoria. It was established by the member states, and this has enabled the countries to cooperate together because there's a protocol in place. And then, of course, we have talked about the Nile Basin Initiative that has structured governance. We have the ministers in charge of water at the top, and then we have the Technical Advisory Committee, and then we have the technical working groups and the secretariats, and then at NELSAP we have the coordination unit. So with the institutional frameworks in place and the legal frameworks, we also need to have proper financing, and we have country contribution from member states and also development partners coming in to finance. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Indeed, very important factors. Hastings, I mean, your title is a program manager for information systems. So I guess information, data and information, that's like your home field, I guess.
Yes. You see, when you pick any agreement, most of the agreements across the world, we know that there are 5 elements in there. There's the scope, the extent of the cooperation in terms of where exactly are you, as the basin extending. The issues with substantive rules, procedural rules, dispute resolution, also the institutional setup itself, Basically, there are 5 elements in there, but I'll pick the element of procedural rules. That's what I think contributes to. One of the elements under procedural rules is that there has to be data and information sharing. And that's very critical. So for us, as an example, in ZAMCOM, when ZAMCOM was established, 2015 officially, of course there was an interim one, we said, look, we need instruments for cooperation. And one of the instruments for cooperation was the rules and procedures for data sharing. And that was the Bible for our information system. We have an established information system that is both the Windows-based, that is the Office version, and also the web version, where the countries can actually access and get whatever they feel like. For instance, they can look at the knowledge products. For instance, I want to learn what are the policies in Zimbabwe, or what are the policies in Botswana, or I want to learn what are some of the studies to do with the environmental issues within the Zambezi. I can look up those documents. So we have documents in there, we have hydrological data in there, and we also, of course, spatial data. So it's very critical that you have in place some kind of transparency. Because if you don't want to share data, then it becomes extremely difficult to cooperate, actually. Of course, there are challenges, with data sharing, because some countries feel that it's to do with their security or things like that. But it's one thing I've learned through my experience with the transboundary cooperation. It's iterative. You have to keep knocking. Otherwise, If you say today that, colleagues, we agreed that quarterly we'll be exchanging data, you are yet to submit your data. You may not receive it right there and then, but you have to keep knocking. And eventually you think that you'll find that eventually they do comply. So it's kind of trust building, transparency, and iterative at the same time.
Yeah.
Keep asking.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the cooperation then becomes a challenge. Thank you.
That's interesting. Thanks for that. I think, again, this issue with trust is coming up. We heard it before, and that seems to be quite important for cooperation to take a firmer route, so to say. I think also the transparency aspect, I mean, you can have a lot of data and information, but unless it's open, unless it's shared, it's just sitting there, basically. So that's critical. Tahani, from your perspective, how the most one or two important factors you would see as promoting cooperation?
Well, I fully agree with my colleagues regarding having a setup, institutional setup, and of course for data sharing. But I have to add two conditions. The first one is the inclusivity in the basin. So the proper transboundary cooperation on the basin level is when all the countries are there in the institution functioning properly without having any objections on any of the terms or procedures. Most important as well, especially in Africa and in complex basins specifically, is the prior notification, specifically the prior notification. This is very important. And this is not an invention. We have it in SADC protocol, loud and clear, in 1997, loud and clear. This is very important as well, is how to move together, notifying each other and sitting on the table and discussing things before starting. I think those are major things. Another thing that I want to add is that never lose contact. Even if you have some conflictive appearance in some areas, you still have to keep your bilaterals ongoing. Yeah. This is very important as well, because it's very negative to cut all the ropes that are binding the transboundary or the riparians together. These are the most important ones from my point of view. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Your last point there of not kind of cutting the ropes, but maintain relations, I think that's a very wise insight. Thank you so much. Lenka, over to you.
Yes, just to add two more points. The first one, which really very practically contributes very substantially in our case to deeper cooperation, is the joint field surveys that we undertake, where we have officials from each of the countries actually visiting, you can call them hot spots or a lot of other descriptions, but visiting the main parts of the river basin from where it starts to where it enters the sea. That within the Orange Synchro is one of the flagships in terms of building cooperation, because from there you have the trust built, you have transparency, because where there is pollution, people actually see the pollution happening. So they are able to inspect and to visit pollution spots, water quality problems, water abstraction issues, large dams, whether it's hydropower facility or anything like that. That is very important, I think. The second one, which colleagues have not mentioned, I believe, has to do with joint infrastructure planning. That is very, very important. We have an example. I know Anton will know about this, but we have an example of, getting some water from the Kingdom of Lesotho, supplying in Lesotho through the Republic of South Africa and delivering a certain quantity in Botswana. That is a very important transboundary infrastructure and water supply program, but it was only possible because the countries were able to pull together their plans, only the relevant ones, because some of the other countries are larger, much larger than Lesotho, and it wouldn't be possible to bring everything. But just looking at those relevant plans, you were able to then strategize and agree on which portions of those could constitute or make up a transboundary project of that magnitude. Those are some of the very practical examples which I wanted to include in terms of building cooperation between countries. Thank you.
Thanks for that, and I think also very practical advice on joint programming, joint investments in infrastructure or other types of activities. Caliste, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll build on what colleagues have mentioned. To me, I think the most important thing is to have joint planning following the basin, but also involving the people on the ground. I think transboundary water cooperation has tended to be international and national, and oftentimes we have not involved the people on the ground. But through stakeholder engagement from the ground level, the local level, up to the highest level, is very, very important so that you have joint identification of the issues in the basin, but also joint identification of the causes, and then jointly propose solutions that can be implemented. And through that, then, we build trust among the communities that actually on the different sides of the border, but also we come up with a joint investment strategy. That's where then countries are motivated to contribute to the investments, but also data sharing. Under the Nile Basin Initiative, I remember we had the challenge of data sharing. But when we target these projects that the countries are designing together, the countries then would share the data. So again, working together to ensure that we have extensive stakeholders engagement is very, very key, so that cooperation is grounded on the issues. Oftentimes we talk about cooperation, but do the people on the ground actually appreciate that? And we have examples we have done, for example, between Uganda and Kenya, where we go to the people to actually identify the benefits of cooperation themselves. Then they identify projects that can be implemented, and through that, the country is actually preparing proposals. They're already implementing projects on the ground. So again, for you to have that, you need to have a structure, an institutional structure to get that going. And of course, then leadership between the countries involved becomes very key. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Caliste. Reiterating really the importance of joint programming between countries. Art, over to you.
Yes, for me the most important factor is the political leadership. They should be ready to face the problem and to be motivated to solve the problem, and also ready to give it a follow-up and to give the political support so that they every year they meet and to see the progress on this transboundary cooperation, because we know several examples of where you have everything in place, the whole structure, but nothing is happening. I just want to mention the Ganges Treaty between Bangladesh and India. It's there already for many years, but nothing happens. And then it brings to the important aspect is this data, and the procedure should be clear, the data should be open, access to all, and the different countries should also be ready to give in. They should not persist to impose their data sharing system or data information systems to the others. So common data set and shared information which is publicly available for all.
Thanks for those wise words. Indeed, leadership, I think that's critical too. And I think you all highlighted basically what is seen as some of the key elements of cooperation and how these elements play out. Let's take some, I'm sure you have lots of questions now out here in the audience. We have a mic here, I think, if we can get some help, super. So I think we have one here, one up. You have to come closer, too far away. If you. So let's take like maybe some 1, 2, maybe 3 questions, we'll see. Please start.
Yes, my name is Ralph. I'm a graduate in agriculture economics from University of Copenhagen. Now, I obviously love everything that involves with cooperation, and especially game theory and all that's really fascinating. Now, one thing that I do notice is that you talk a lot about trust. and the lack of trust between parties. This, I think, also relates to data sharing and who controls sensors, who controls this type of data that is available. Have you considered maybe imposing some sort of blockchain technology to design some type of smart contract where people and agencies can share data on a trusted platform where no one can intercept the data? Has that been something that you may have considered? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to here.
Thanks very much. My name is Ken Irvin. I'm from the Institute of Water Education in the Netherlands. And I'm struck out by your question, your comments about the Sandel disaster, the chemical spill, as a prelude perhaps to European policy shifts. But I wouldn't ask the question about this idea of never waste a good crisis. What about when there is no visible crisis? What about when there was a gradual degradation of ecosystem quality, of water resources, those things which are sort of insidious and slow, but actually at the end of the day are just losing a lot of resources, both in terms of ecosystems and in terms of support for human communities.
Is there a question?
The question is how to deal with that long, slow, small changes that are not perceptible on a day-to-day basis. So it's the crisis is longer term, not the immediate sort of chemical spill. I'd be interested in comments on that.
Two different questions here. Maybe let's start with a trust-related one. It was mentioned here as important, and really how we can use technologies, digital technologies like blockchain, for example, for increased transparency and so forth, and as part of trust building. Like from your own experience, how are you utilizing these new technologies, for example? Are we kind of digitalizing the water sector or not? What does it look like, please? And Hastings, yeah, then Art.
Yeah, let me just start by giving an example from our institution. I think you are right. We can use these technologies, or even, for instance, you talked about going into a contract, if I heard you correctly, maybe things like MOUs. That is, of course, to ensure that countries abide by the rules that are set. In our case, of course, like I said, we have the rules and procedures for sharing data and information. But what we have noticed is that these procedures were just adopted by the Council of Ministers outside the actual agreement. When you look at the agreement, there are signatures there. Look at these rules and procedures, they were just okay, adopted on 15th of whatever. So we realized that I think there's something missing here. What we want to do now is that through the support from the African Development Bank, we have a program, what we're calling a Program for Integrated Development and Adaptation to Climate Change. Through that, we have a regional component where they're supporting some activities at the regional level. So one of the activities we have agreed is perhaps let's develop what we call water charter. What are these? These are like annexes, like in terms of describing exactly how this data will be shared and what formats and like maybe those technologies. We describe that in the charter and then put it as an annex to the agreement where the ministers who append those signatures should appear in that water charter. So then that maybe gives like some kind of mandatory, or it becomes mandatory for the countries to make sure that this data is shared, through that. So we hope that may help in terms of
that's right.
that, yeah.
Thanks so much for that very concrete example. Art, over to you.
Yes, in this water, it's about this quantity. It's always the issue how much water you have and for what you use it. And the main factor in the water use is the irrigation in the agriculture. And with remote sensing, you can get very clear information. The FAO has now a water productivity database, and you can see on the level of every catchment how much water is used by agriculture. And you see very interesting things that, for example, in one country they use for the production of 1 kilogram of rice double the amount of water as the other one. So that information is publicly available, and so the negotiators have the access, and they can say, yeah, why I should leave water for you because you waste it in a downstream country. So this is going on very fast, and it's there. And people, they sometimes they think that all the information is still hidden in their country, and they are the only one of the information, but the information is publicly available.
Thanks a lot for that. Let's also go to the other question here, which was more about, well, in many cases, it's also much slower changes where, for example, the ecosystem gradually worsens, for example, or water quality in different ways, which may take a long time before it creates these emergencies that Art alluded to before, for example. Which makes good sense too. It's out of a crisis, you have to do something. So how do you see this play out, for example? Or can we still act much quicker despite we have a lot of situations where it's this more gradual, slower change, for example? Kellis?
Thank you very much. To me, I think the importance of monitoring and also communicating the monitoring results becomes very important. Even when changes are slower, if one has a monitoring network, then one should be able to notice the changes and be able to raise an alarm. Of course, the way the information is received will not be the same as when there is a disaster, but at least you will be able to communicate so that everybody can know that even when the changes are slower, there is already an impact, and if not addressed, then the impact will be much bigger as you progress. So to me, I think setting up monitoring networks is going to be very key, but also communicating the results of the monitoring, also in the language that people can understand, and maybe the use of the media would also actually help. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Lincoln?
Yeah, the English can be an interesting language. You know, when you say slow and gradual, it looks like nothing is happening, but actually a lot can be seen out of something that is slow and gradual. If you go to the Orange Senku and you visit the higher elevations of the river system in the Kingdom of Lesotho, you find this erosion and land degradation, which is slow and gradual, like said here, but it's very devastating because it impacts the livelihoods of the communities there, and it impacts the source of the river system, which fills up the dams that Lesotho then shares with its neighbors. So these things, I think that's where the cooperation is important, because when somebody comes in from the River Commission and looks at the river system as a whole, or the river basin as a whole, they are able to pick out that gradual and slow problem that is manifesting in that part of the river system will actually reach a tipping point at some stage, and then start affecting the other countries as well. So cooperation is important in those areas as well. And I think, again, giving credit to our cooperating partners, they are able to help us work together to describe, define, and research on some of these points which have not yet reached a tipping point, but are slow and gradual, which means maybe not very visible to some people. But I'm not a very good supporter of that slow and gradual. I think we should just take it as important as any other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gladys, yeah?
I just want to maybe look at it differently. Because slow and gradual means it's not seen immediately, and maybe in cases where there's no cooperation yet, then the problem is discovered much later by maybe the affected country. So cooperation may come in because it has been noticed. So it's still a challenge. So it's not something, unless there's already cooperation going on, that's when through monitoring you can identify it. But in cases where there's no cooperation, then that slow and gradual effect will be notified when the maybe neighboring country finds out, which then is treated as a crisis.
Yes, I'd like to add one small element, but it's a very important one, I believe. It's the capacity building, how you can face these small, gradual, or devastating changes. I think that being capable to face it, whether on the national level or on the transboundary level, this is also important. Sometimes you have the information, you have the readings, and you don't know how to do about it. So I believe that, yes, data exchange is very important, and monitoring is very important, but being capable of facing the disasters, whether they are disasters or they are slow and gradual. We have, for example, the Nile Delta. We can consider it as a small and slow and gradual thing, but it's a problem, and it has many, many social and economic implications. So being capable of facing these challenges is very important. So capacity building is key, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Art?
Yeah, politicians are not interested in these slow, long-standing problems. They are interested in shows and elections and getting the people vote for them again. They think not longer than 4 years ahead. Then we are already happy. But we as technicians, we know that these slow set problems are very important. So we should try to keep the information on the table, and also to translate the cost of enacting this, and make people aware, and train journalists, and train people in the parliament, and say, yes, this will happen when you